maybe I should stop there and take questions if anyone has any.
What kind of paper do you use? Are we allowed to ask that?
You are allowed to ask that. I use usually printmaking paper because it's got a little bit more of a body to it, and it will forgive all my aggressive cutting. Sometimes I'll use something a little bit more light and transparent, like a rice paper or mulberry paper. The bigger pieces are ink and gouache and mulberry paper. And sometimes I like that transparency to be part of it. But when they're more constructed, it's usually a thicker paper so that it can kind of hold up to when I'm sort of putting it through.
Yeah. Do you establish a color for a certain pattern before you get started arranging them, or do you wait till they're arranged and then you impose a color pattern on top of them?
I would say I probably do a little bit of both. I sort of have a lot of the colors in these sort of began actually being pulled from Darger's drawings. I sort of took his palette, which is kind of like sort of a 60s sort of muted but colorful sort of range, and then kind of improvised from there. Especially with the piece that's over on this wall here, that color really like came out of nowhere, and after I had finished it, I was sort of shocked by what I had put together. It was a little bit more color than a larger range of color than I usually took on for myself. And so sometimes things just kind of happen, and I only am able to reflect on them after, but sometimes they are influenced by the sources that I'm drawing from.
Yeah.
When you say this is not to Henry Darger, I think of Henry Darger as lots of people.
Yeah.
And that sort of reminds me of his palette, the fourth one. But can you elaborate a little more on Henry Darger and
Sure.
the people part? I mean, or the
Sure.
laughter?
No, that's a great question, because it's true that Darger's work is full of figures, and they're the driving force of that narrative. But what I would say to that is that I think that landscape is just as big of a character. That when you look at his work, there's a real what's the word I want to use? Oh, great. Okay, here we are. There's a real animate quality to where his figures are put. Mm-hmm. And you can sort of, if you look across those scrolls, you know, these kids will be in a garden, and it sort of set the scene for something tranquil, but then that garden turns into this sort of thunderstorm as you move across that work. And so it's like the natural elements in his work seem to have much of narrative presence as the figures themselves, if that makes any sense. So I sort of tried to look at, you know, that the element that maybe doesn't get so focused on with him because of his characters are so ever present, and they have, you know, strange attributes, which I haven't really mentioned here today. Right. That's usually the lens which I think most people look at Darger's work and try to decipher it. And I guess I wanted to highlight something that I felt like was really interesting and beautifully made, but not paid attention to as much.
Natasha, what about the drawings? You brought 4 drawings that are on the plaque.
Oh, right. My alphabets. Yeah. So those are, which you're welcome to look at. I also in Roswell, I sort of tend to take on a lot of different bodies of work at once because I like that. That's the way that I work best. And I got really interested in these abecedariums from. I mean, they go back to the Middle Ages, probably before. Different ways of making alphabets. They're a little bit more simpler in concept, but I just like the idea of coming up with these new forms of letters that were playful and just sort of, you know, unexpected. I guess the point that I would make with those is that, you know, of course there are a lot of ways to craft a letter. There are many people that specialize in font and all the subtleties that come with those you know, minute changes. But I think that also, you know, there's sort of a playfulness that words can have that sort of the burden of them needing to communicate, sometimes that kind of sucks out the playfulness that a letter could take on form-wise. And so I felt like I wanted to bring some of that playfulness back to the word, back to the letter.
And this one is the fish.
The fish, yeah. There's fish and tigers and a few other insects and birds. Yeah, thank you.
They're all over here if y'all want to take a look.
On that idea, the language idea.
Yeah.
So like when you were a kid, did you like reading? Like like for me, I like individual words.
Yeah.
I have much more trouble with like poetry and how you put it together.
Sure.
It's always very difficult for me. Or like when I listen to music, the lyrics are really only a sound.
Right.
Rather than like all my friends would talk about the meaning of the lyrics, and I was like, oh, is that what?
Right.
So sort of how did you approach language? Like, sort of where do you find yourself? Are you interested in language because you were really into it, or is it because maybe it was difficult and you didn't get it as a giant concept?
That's a great question. I've always loved to read. I was a classics major in addition to an arts major, and so I've always been interested in storytelling and the written word, and I like taking on, I mean, from the whole gamut, from reading, like, I love reading kids' stories still, because I think they're actually really great at playing with language in a very simple, direct way. But I also like taking on things like Herman Melville, which is not an easy task. I mean, and you know, I like that feeling of reading for enjoyment, but also reading to get through like some kind of burden. And I've always been drawn to stories, and I didn't mention folklore, but especially sort of folkloric stories about transformation. That's always been sort of around in the background, even as a kid. I really like stories where one character would sort of unexpectedly change into the next. A really good example of that kind of tradition is you read any Native American storytelling, and it's almost dizzying to try to keep track of who's who, because everyone's in a constant state of change. Actually I could read you guys a story. I brought it with me about just that. But sort of that notion of like the shapeshifter, not only as a character, but that idea of the word as a shapeshifter has always been of interest to me. I mean, I wouldn't have said that I was interested in that when I was a child, the word shapeshifting, but the word actually being the shapeshifter. But yeah, stories of transformation and stories of things in flux has always been like a major, that's where I got most excited. Does that answer your, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Back to process a little bit.
Yeah.
What cutting tools do you use?
I just use a simple X-Acto blade, sometimes scissors, and my own hands. That's it. I've never sort of dabbled in laser cutting. Sometimes people suggest that. I think it's really important for me to sort of be in the thick of the cutting, and I also find that cutting things by hand, it really slows things down sometimes in a way that it's almost like a meditative act for me, which is really important, and that's sort of keeps me engaged and keeps me interested in what I'm doing. So yeah, just simple materials.
Okay, and I want to ask one
Yeah, sure.
question too. Okay, so this item is fascinating. Okay, I'm like show and tell. So I'm fascinated with, so in Roswell, you did this site-specific, like 20 feet wide?
Yeah, about, yeah.
So like that wall, basically. So do you paint on the wall first and then do the layers out, or that's all paper?
So I do paint. The painting is sort of a relatively new process for me. I do paint on the wall first and then install layers of paper in front. And I should say that that's like actually another important part of my work that you don't see here today, but it are these large cut paper installations. And the reason that they're really important is they balance out the things that get kind of fixed into one stage or state. Those pieces are also built out of pattern and text, but they go together differently every time. They never repeat one formation. So when that piece came down, the paper got put away, the wall painting got painted over, and when I put that work back up again, I'll have added to it and it will go into a completely different composition that doesn't resemble its original form. So that's a way for me, the installations are a way for me to keep pieces going that are never finished, which, as you may have pieced together by now, I like things remaining in a transitory state, and so that kind of allows me
You're
to
a
do that.
shapeshifter. You're a shapeshifter. I'm sorry.
I wish.
And I'm sorry, not
yeah,
to plug, but
no.
aren't you're doing a major site-specific installation
Yes. Yeah. So most likely in 2014, I'm going to be doing sort of kind of taking off from this Roswell piece, bringing a garden inside the gallery. In this case, in the Savannah College of Art and Design Museum down there. They have a big installation space, so I'll be doing a site-specific installation for them. Yeah. Thanks, Beth. Yeah, sure.
Like these are all very clean and neat.
Yeah.
And it's another process question. Like, how are you what's your studio like? Like, is it just trash with paper?
Yeah.
Or is it like that kind of blender of process, or are you very, like, things are organized? I'm just kind of curious.
It's a great question. When I show images, I usually show an image of my studio, and it's like if a bomb went off in there and just threw everything up, and I left it where it landed. It's a total mess, and that's actually, I think, pretty important. I think if it were clean and organized, things would not. Sort of happy accidents wouldn't happen. I mean, a lot of the way that I come to final imagery is that something will fall on the floor and it looks good with something I never expected it to, but because the floor is layered with 30 layers of paper, I can kind of see it happen out there in an organic way. So yeah, it's a total mess, and it takes like a lot of effort to come up with the final like clean paper top. Like that's actually not my strength, and so and really the reason for that, I should say, that clean final layer, and I'm talking about just these existing on that clean white, is that hopefully really the white is just, it's a neutral, it kind of falls away, and you really just look at the image in the center, that the image in the center is more like an object and less like a representation of one, if that makes any sense. The white is sort of meant to fall behind and not be paid attention to. But the larger pieces are a lot messier, and I like that about them because they feel a little bit more aggressive too in their messiness, which I like to put out there also. But yeah. Anyone else? Or you can ask me questions later in private. I'm happy to answer anything. And if anyone wants to get a gander at Darger, there's this lovely book up here. I encourage you to. And thank you all for coming. Yeah, thanks.